This week we're going to start with the criminal complaint of the attempted assassin of Donald Trump.
Keep walking! Keep that long.
There were a lot of confusion on Twitter and in the internet about exactly what this guy was being charged with, what's going on, and so I wanted to break that down a little bit. So first, people were a little bit shocked that he was only charged with 2 counts: possession of a firearm by a prohibited person, that is a convicted felon, and possession of a firearm with an obliterated serial number. And the initial reaction to this was, what gives? You know, this is the attempted assassin of Donald Trump. And so the first takeaway that some people were getting from that is, oh, then this guy wasn't really attempting to kill the former president of the United States. But that's not right. I'm sure you saw some of that going around, right? From Blue MAGA.
Can I take a guess on what it actually is?
Yeah, go for it.
My guess is it's a corrupt DOJ that's unwilling to prosecute. Either that, or they probably have to charge him with some kind of crime so that they can hold on to him until they can get formal charges or something else.
Start with that angle. So okay. There are 2 angles that I think, one from Blue MAGA, which I consider to be the kind of, you might say, assumption-taking left, and the other from actual Red MAGA, who take the sort of conspiracy route. So let's start with the one that you took. One route that people were taking and interpreting from the Red MAGA was, this shows the corruption of the DOJ. They're not even going to call this what it was, an attempted assassination of the former president. But that's not entirely true. So the standard for bringing an indictment or bringing charges to people is probable cause. But as a matter of policy and as a matter of just the practicalities of running a prosecution, you don't really want to bring an indictment until you have proof beyond a reasonable doubt that someone is guilty of an offense.
Just to be clear, when we're assigning probabilities to these, right? If a cop pulls you over and he sees something and he has reasonable suspicion, and then he's trying to investigate until he can find probable cause, and then when you convict somebody in criminal court beyond a reasonable doubt, what are the rough percentages for how sure you need to be for these thresholds to be met in the American legal system?
Sure, yeah. So the American system doesn't put exact percentages on it, but people have kind of estimated it due to case law. So for example, probable cause is the normal standard for arrests, for getting warrants, and people put that roughly in the 33% chance. And why is that actually? Because we have there was a case, I actually forget the name of it, but essentially there were a choice of 3 doors, and one of, the bad guy had gone under one of them. There was an exception to the warrant requirement, and he opened one that it wasn't actually the bad guy, but the question was, did he have probable cause to open one of those doors? The answer was yes. And so you can sort of gather, Stephen, you get a rough approximation for that.
So if you're trying to run into an apartment building to escape the police, make sure that it's at least a 4-unit apartment
4
building.
doors, yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. And reasonable suspicion, which you mentioned, is different than probable cause. That's a burden of proof usually to stop and investigate. It's called stop and frisk. So that might be to pull you over. It's what's known as a Terry stop. And that is some standard. It's less than probable cause. You might say a cop sees you speeding, right? You have probably probable cause to pull you over. But if you have a crime scene, maybe you have reasonable suspicion that anyone in the area could be involved or could have some evidence related to that. Not exact percentage, but something less than maybe in the 33% range. Beyond a reasonable doubt, that is the standard that people are very familiar with to convict someone of a crime in court. And that is take it to the 99%, right? Some super high threshold where there's no reasonable doubt that this person is guilty of the offense. You with me so far, Steve?
Yep.
Okay. And to sort of put out what this guy could be accused of, suppose that we were going to take a murder statute to apply, or homicide statute to apply to this guy. He didn't actually kill anyone, right? So we can't charge him with the substantive offense of murder, because the substantive elements of murder are to cause the death of another human being with malice aforethought. But of course, no one's dead. And so what can you charge him with? That's the realm of attempt liability. And attempt liability, and I guess we're going to start with Blue MAGA, actually, I lied to you, isn't, with respect to an assassin, did he take a shot? Did he have this, the victim in sight? What you're hearing from a lot of left-wing commentators are the fact that the evidence seems to indicate that the shooter never fired a bullet or never had Trump in his scopes means this wasn't actually an attempt. Under the law, that's not what's required. What's required is the intent to commit that substantive offense. So in this case, the intent to cause the death of another human being, which we'll talk about the evidence for that so far. I think it's pretty clear that that was what he wanted to do, unless you have any disagreements.
No, and I think this, to summarize real quick, we would agree that this makes sense because without being able to charge like this, for instance, you would never have any sort of sting operation ever, right? Because if you have somebody, there was that famous case, I don't remember the lady's name, who was talking to, I think it was an officer trying to set up a plan to murder her husband. If you need the thing to actually happen to be able to charge anybody with an attempt, or if they have to have like taken, like had a real chance of killing somebody, then there's no type of like police sting operation that would ever be chargeable for a crime, right?
Right, and so you need that intent, and you need a substantial step. And a substantial step is not some threshold where we know you're going to be successful, as Stephen mentioned. It's basically showing that you have acted with the kind of culpability that would be required to commit the offense. And one of the classic examples of a substantial step is lying in wait. And this guy was literally, according to sources, lying in wait for like hours and hours on end with a GoPro, had the gun pointed out through the fence. That's going to constitute a substantial step. But let's get back to the charging decision. Well, then why not charge him, right? Well, actually, right, you're going to eventually have to prove this case in court. And you're going to want to have evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that this guy actually intended to kill Donald Trump. If you just go and, guns blazing and just said, well, obviously it's true, you maybe won't have as strong of a case if you have, for instance, a bunch of evidence from his phones or from third parties that might illuminate his state of mind at the time. Once you charge, it can complicate getting more evidence when you use a grand jury to charge, because you're really not supposed to use a grand jury once you indict to investigate the very thing that someone's been indicted for. So it's a little bit more complicated, and it can lead to some troubles gathering evidence. You really want to wait until you have all the evidence before you charge. Well, then why did you get gun charges? That's to hold him, right? You want to charge him with something. So charge him with the thing that, okay, it's super easy to prove. This is a gun. Its serial was defaced. He was in possession of it. He's a previous felon in possession of a gun. Charge him, hold him. And so I hope that clears things up for people about why they would charge the lesser offenses, and why it doesn't mean that he didn't criminally attempt to kill the president. Doesn't mean that more charges aren't going to be coming. I highly, highly suspect they will be from the federal grand jury, probably related to murder. And it doesn't mean necessarily that the DOJ is doing anything corrupt or not investigating this to the fullest. The opposite, in fact. They're doing their due diligence, and they're taking their time before they charge to gather the evidence.
One thing too, and you can tell me, I think it differs jurisdiction by jurisdiction, but I think in some places, I don't know if they call it, it's not charging down the line, but it's something where you can charge first, second, third degree, or first, second manslaughter or whatever. But in some places, I think you can only charge one, and if you fail to get a conviction on that, all the other ones don't count. Like you can't charge somebody with first degree murder, and if you fail on that, well, we could at least convict on second degree or third degree manslaughter. Is that true in most jurisdictions? Is it in all jurisdictions, or do you have an idea?
I've done a survey on, I think what you're referencing are lesser included offenses.
Yes, yeah, that.
I haven't done a survey on, like a 50-state survey on what the relative percentages are of different jurisdictions applying those rules. But yeah, you could imagine that there could be some difficulties in like bringing your case to bear, even just for the jury, right? The jury maybe is less willing to split the baby, even if it were legally, technically okay, procedurally okay to bring these kind of lesser included offenses, if you don't have all the evidence and you don't have all your ducks in a row. You don't want to mess up this case. It's kind of like the Alec Baldwin situation, if you recall. Now you can have your own opinions about whether he was guilty or not, but there was a Brady violation and prosecutorial misconduct which scuttled that case, along with other kind of issues that weren't the basis of the dismissal, but the prosecutorial misconduct really jeopardized that case and even the case they've already convicted on. And so it's very important for our system that prosecutors who hold enormous power take their time, get the evidence before charging, and everyone who is spreading misinformation, either from the left or the right, about why the charges were the way they were, are doing a disservice to our institutions and to our system of government.
Yeah, I fully agree. I feel like a lot of the complaints that people have about different systems or institutions usually just stem from not understanding what is actually going on. And if you had just a little bit of understanding, I think things make a lot more sense when you see how people are doing them. As you said, in the United States of America, what is it? I think constitutionally, for an arraignment, is it like 2 days you have to be arraigned on charges? They can't just hold you indefinitely in a jail cell for months at a time, waiting to see if they can find a charge for you. So if you don't charge them with something, then you have to let them walk. And then obviously people would have a huge issue with that. And but also if you charge them with crimes ahead of time, another thing that's important is you bring up that beyond a reasonable doubt standard. Like, it might be really obvious that somebody has done a thing. People don't realize that in life, we don't operate on that standard and on a person-to-person basis. You operate on a way lesser standard. So it might be really clear to you and to every person that, like, this guy probably wanted to kill this dude, but that probably is not good enough. And yeah, it might be that ultimately charges are brought or aren't based on other evidence that they uncover, but it doesn't necessarily play into corruption. It has to do with whether or not they can meet and then exceed that beyond a reasonable doubt standard in front of a jury, which is a whole thing. That's a whole other thing in and of itself.
I totally agree with that. On the arraignment point, different states might have different rules on the books. There's a constitutional minimum. I think it might be 48 hours, but as a matter of practice, sometimes that's not met. But for these kinds of cases, important to make sure that we're dotting our I's and crossing our T's. And so appreciate that, Stephen, and totally agree. Speaking about, though, potential government corruption, there's a clear and present danger to the voting system and the voters in North Carolina. Did you know that, Stephen?
Which one are we talking about?
Who do you think I'm talking about, Stephen?
Mark Robinson?
No.
Okay. He is a danger.
Good question. He is a danger in other ways. And for those of you who haven't watched or read CNN's wonderful reporting on that matter, you should. He's a self-avowed black Nazi pervert who, even though he's against LGBTQ rights, enjoys transgender porn, likes Hitler, but that's all in CNN's reporting. I would agree he's a clear and present danger in some sense, but he's losing in the polls. And so I actually think that there's another danger in North Carolina.
There might
be.
And also, just to be clear, Pisco doesn't think that being a Nazi and enjoying transgender porn are on the same level. These are just a thing to add to the basket of hypocrisies of
hypocrisy. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. It's just part of the hypocrisy. And of course, we shouldn't be electing people who say one thing but mean another, or who say, for example, that abortion is murder, but then have abortions like Mark Robinson did as well. Honestly, I think that the voters should have a say in that. And I think that they're having their rights curtailed. And they're having their rights curtailed by a person. And that person's name is Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Uh-oh.
In North Carolina, there is a statutory obligation, a right that North Carolinians have to vote 60 days before an election. That's a right in law. Brings us to RFK Jr. A few weeks back, maybe a month or so back, RFK Jr., before trying to sell his services like a mercenary, announces that he is suspending his campaign, not terminating the campaign. Very clear, not terminating. And he announces some states where he wants to be off the ballot. Doesn't include North Carolina in the list of states in his announcement.
That's really interesting, Pisco.
Yeah.
Why some and not the other?
Well, because he's playing a game. This guy, RFK Jr., is playing a game. He's trying, on his own whims, to step away in states where he thinks he could negatively affect Trump, stay on in states where he thinks it might benefit Trump or benefit himself in some way. And there's a little bit of a cute wink, wink, nudge, nudge. This is what I'm doing. And in the course of doing so, he is depriving North Carolinians, or did deprive North Carolinians, of their right to vote. And I'll explain how. He did not mention North Carolina in his termination speech. North Carolina has rules for when it is you are supposed to get your name off of a ballot if you're a candidate. Can you think of some policy rationales for why it might make sense for a state to have a cutoff date for when you want to withdraw from the ballot?
My first guess is going to be due to early voting.
Yeah, they have to print the ballots, right? They have to
need time to prepare and everything too.
Logistics, right? And so that's what happened, right? North Carolina has a cutoff date for when you're supposed to withdraw your name from the ballot. That's also a matter of law. It's black letter law. It's clear as day. And North Carolina printed millions of ballots. And actually thousands of different kinds of ballots, because you imagine you're going to different places within the state of North Carolina. There can be different seats for different places. So thousands of different types of ballots, millions of ballots. A couple days after the state's cutoff period for when you're supposed to withdraw from the election, Robert F. Kennedy is asking to be taken off the ballot, even though the cutoff date has passed. The ballots have been printed. Voting is supposed to start within days. And he wants to have them all destroy the ballots that exist and print new ones, millions of ballots. The necessary effect of that is voting will be delayed. Voting will be delayed because, as I told you, there's a 60-day right to vote in the state of North Carolina. And that's exactly what the North Carolina Supreme Court allowed. In a preposterous ruling, the partisan North Carolinian Supreme Court, in a 4-3 decision, decided that the whims of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. should override the people's right to vote in North Carolina. We are now 2 weeks from when that occurred, and finally, yesterday, ballots were sent to the people. You want to talk about the litigation against RFK Jr., how it's so unfair. RFK Jr. Shouldn't have been sued in New York when he lied about his residency, or RFK Jr., it was wrong for us to have any rules for him to be on the ballot. I think it's wrong for RFK Jr. on his own whims, in a bad faith manner, getting off the ballot in some states, getting on in other states, to deprive North Carolinians of their right to vote for 2 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I feel like there's a lot of these stupid games being played. I'm very hesitant to take anything at face value when I'm hearing reports about Jill Stein or RFK, being on some ballots and being off other ballots, especially when people aren't following procedures. I guess the thing that is the most irritating is it's very obvious in some of these cases, assuming everything you've told me is true here, that you're just playing a game, and it's like it's not even a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. It's like a blatantly like, I'm trying to screw you guys over, but I'm going to appeal to the procedure here as much as possible, and then appeal it up to the Supreme Court, and hopefully they'll give me a politically favorable ruling. I think it's pretty disgusting, but.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why the news of Robinson is relevant now. Is Friday was the day where you're supposed to, or maybe the day before, was the day that you were supposed to, the final day for you to decide whether or not you want to be your candidate, your party's candidate. And so there was a question about whether Ken Robinson even withdraw after this revelation came out, unless he does so in this particular window. And so officially, it's over. So he's going to be the candidate, and when you put your mark on Robinson, it's going to go to him and not any other candidate the Republicans might want to nominate. But does anyone now have the confidence that if this were to go to the North Carolina Supreme Court, despite the black letter law of what the rules say, that they would follow it? And I think that some things that these rulings do is they undermine the faith that the people have that the rules are as written. And one of the reasons we were supposed to prefer textualist judges is the kind of predictive nature of their rulings. But it seems that sometimes certain politicians are going to be favored over others. And that's exactly what I believe is happening in North Carolina.
Yeah, I feel like in the legal world, there's this word textualist or originalist. And in the streamer world, I think we have the exact same word, but we call it like rational or logical or truth. Like whenever somebody uses this word, they're just trying to have this appearance of being like so nonpartisan and so apolitical and so just like dedicated to the facts. And every time I hear a conservative judge say something like, oh yeah, a textual historical reading of, whatever, it feels like they just say that. And if there's something that pops up that doesn't align with that textual reading of whatever document, then all of a sudden we are the most living, breathing constitution that's open for whatever interpretation that we could possibly have in front of us. And it's very irritating to hear that. If you would just own it and say it, I'd be fine with it. But yeah, that fetishization of the originalism and the textualism in all cases, except when it just doesn't benefit you politically, is very irritating to me.
Do you know who Puff Daddy is, Destiny?
Of course, I was a Puff Daddy connoisseur growing up, but why don't you explain for the audience?
Sure. So Puff Daddy, a.k.a. P. Diddy, a.k.a. Sean Combs, a.k.a. Diddy, a.k.a. PD, a.k.a. Love, and they put all those names in the indictment.
Of world famous, well, they become world famous freak-offs.
Yes. So he's a rapper, a part of the hip hop community, a mogul, some might say, a producer, and has obviously been in the game for decades. He was affiliated with Biggie Smalls and other kind of rap peoples, who have relied on him for their careers and has had a big influence on hip hop and rap in general. He was indicted over certain things that he and his associates, let's say, have done. And I thought it was a good opportunity for us to briefly discuss RICO, because you often will hear conversations about RICO and this reference to RICO, and it's actually very mystifying for certain people. And I thought it might be helpful to briefly go over what RICO is about, and then you guys can take it, what you've just learned, and apply it to the what you just, if you want to read the indictment of Sean Combs, aka P. Diddy.
I got 20 people, okay? And I think all of these guys, they're all like trying to do a bad thing, and I know they are, okay? I got at least a few of them. I know for sure that they are, and everybody's involved in it. But man, for some of these guys, it's gonna be really hard to prove crimes for them. Like, I don't know if I could get all of these guys on conspiracy charges, but they're absolutely all trying to commit this crime. What can I do about it, Pisco? Tell me.
Yeah, sure. So in the 70s, Congress passed the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization Act. I think it's called, I forget exactly the name of the statute, but it brought a new form of charge at that time to deal with organized crime, particularly, but not exclusively, the mob. These were situations in which, like you mentioned, there's a lot of crime going on here, and the nature of the offense relates to the underlying crime, yes, but also the organizational aspect to it. And what RICO did was give an avenue for prosecutors to, A, kind of tar all members of a criminal organization with the underlying acts of each other, and also a way to go up the chain a little bit. And so it really kind of helped prosecutors, some might say too much, with harsh penalties for organized crime. That was kind of the purpose of it. There's a lot of confusion about RICO because people seem to have this assumption that you need to do the underlying acts in order to be charged with them. That's not always the case. So I'm going to go through now the RICO elements and speak a little bit about them. And then you can use what you've learned, and hopefully it'll apply to, or the indictment that you read of P. Diddy will make more sense. And so RICO, there's 4 kind of substantive offenses under RICO, and what I'm about to say will include all of them. It applies to any person, and person here, again, you have to read the definition of person because it might be more broad than you think, who, this is number 2 now, invests in, sub 1, call that little a, B, acquires or maintains an interest in, C, conducts or participates in the affairs of, or D, conspires to, little a, invest in, little b, acquire or maintain an interest in, or little c, conduct or participate in the affairs of. So those are the kind of the what. So if you are investing in something, right, acquiring an interest in something, conducting or participating in the affairs of something, or conspiring, remember a conspiracy is like an underlying meeting of the minds in agreement, conspiring to do any of those 3 things, in an enterprise, that's the organization, right? In the context, if you guys saw the Georgia RICO statutes, that enterprise was like the Trump election enterprise, right? And you can look into the definition of enterprise and how broad and narrow it is and what the contours of it is, but you essentially need some kind of association there. So again, if a person invests in, acquires an interest in, or participates in, or conspires to do those things of an enterprise, that enterprise engages in interstate commerce or foreign commerce, or their activities affect interstate or foreign commerce, that 4th element that I'm going over right now is a jurisdictional hook so that Congress can regulate it. Congress is a government of limited powers. And so you'll often see little things like affecting interstate commerce or utilizing the instrumentalities of interstate commerce or the channels of interstate commerce. That's a way to signal, hey, Supreme Court, we're just limiting our regulation to things over which we have jurisdiction. And so that's the 4th element. And finally, the 5th element, probably the most important to people's minds, a pattern of offenses, of predicate acts, at least 2. So get that in your head. It's about people's participation in, investment towards an enterprise which affects interstate commerce in some way, and that enterprise participates in a pattern of criminal activity, at minimum 2 predicate acts. I'm glossing over a lot of nuance in that description, but the reason I'm giving it to you is that you have a better understanding of what's going on here. So when we expect to see in the indictment of P. Diddy, either conspiracy, RICO, investment RICO, right? Acquiring RICO, conducting RICO. And we actually do see in the indictment a conspiracy. Conspiracies are often easier to prove. You just need to prove that there was an agreement. And you're going to see they're going to have to specify what the enterprise is, and they're going to have to specify the predicate acts. And so you'll see, if you read the indictment now, all the different predicate offenses in terms of, bringing in foreign prostitutes, different financial crimes, different assaults, that kind of thing. And as you read them, understand they're not charging those underlying crimes. They're part of the predicate acts, which are the underlying of the RICO charge. And so that's what he was charged with. There are other charges as well, but I hope that helped a little bit. Stephen, if you have any questions real quick before we sign off, I'll be happy to hear them.
Yeah, no, I think I got it. I think so.
Okay.
Basically, so RICO is there to help you go after larger organizations where they might be so segregated that it would be impossible to ever get leadership at the top, or there might be people participating in ways where it's hard to identify the underlying crime, but they're absolutely involved in an enterprise. And I imagine this probably helps prosecutors and police officers flip lower people to go after larger people and everything as well, too, yeah?
That's right. And so thank you so much, Stephen, and the audience for indulging me. I really appreciate the opportunity to teach you guys some things. And if you have any questions, please put them in the comments.
Cool. Thanks a lot. I'll talk to you next week.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.